And welcome onto another week now, Parshat, this time Parshat Re'eh, and it's the fourth Parsha in the book of Deuteronomy as we speed through this book. And it's in this Parsha that we actually start to read specific mitzvot. Before that, there's a lot of lengthy preamble that Moses gives with the book trying to inspire us to be loyal to God and loyal to the commandments, but now we get into specific commandments. So I'm going to go ahead and share the screen and we'll say a bracha. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kitshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah.
Amen.
Thank you. And
Labriot, Lauren.
and for everybody. So I was just thinking that it is, we read in our tradition what a great mitzvah it is, Talmud Torah Keneged Kulam, that studying Torah is like equivalent to performing all the mitzvot. And in today's section, we may get to it, there's sort of the Torah basis for that idea. But I hope all of you at this point, having studied with me now over a few years, can get the sense of how it's impossible to really understand our religion without getting into the sources and in finding out about them, wrestling with them, and just becoming aware. There's just so much information. So we are here in Parshat Re'eh, as you can see, and we're in the midst of a conversation about meat, about consuming meat. And the previous little section that led to this particular point had to do with the idea of something that is called Chullin, in other words, non-sanctified meat, and that we are permitted to eat non-sanctified meat. And there's further clarification about that. There's mitzvahs about not eating any blood. We may have that repeated again. And a distinction made between sanctified meat and unsanctified meat. And we're going to discuss that as well, and then move on to some other topics. So here we are. Rak kadashecha asher yulecha unarecha. So in contradistinction to what we've been talking about, we're saying only that the Torah is saying only your sanctified, right? The sanctified understood meat, asher yulecha, which you bring, unadarecha, and your vows, in other words, the offerings that you bring, that you've made a vow to bring, because there are also offerings, we know already that there are sacrifices that are not necessarily vowed, where there are obligatory offerings, but here we're talking about non-obligatory offerings that are simply gifts made to God. Tisa, you shall carry, uvata el hamakom, and you shall come to the place asher yivchar Hashem, which Hashem chooses. And that, of course, is a theme that's throughout the book of Deuteronomy, is the centralization of the worship, certainly sacrificial worship, the idea of it being centralized. Jerusalem itself, of course, isn't specified, but we just know that it is a place which God is going to designate. So what is this only your sanctified meat, something like that, right? It's understood. So Rashi says, Afal pi, this nevertheless, or despite the fact, she'ata mutar lishchot chulin, there's this word chulin, even though you're allowed to slaughter meat that is not sanctified, in other words, meat for your own, we could use the word profane as in the understanding of non-sanctified purposes. Lo hitarti lacha, nevertheless, I have not given you permission, lishchot et hakodshim, to slaughter the sanctified objects or sanctified meat, I think it's going to be, or leochlan, excuse me, and to consume them, bisharecha, in your gates, meaning at home. That is not allowed. So while So the rak, the only, means as opposed to non-sanctified meat. When it comes to sanctified meat, you cannot eat it at home, below hakrava, without having offered it up. Ella lahaviam, but you must bring them the veta to that chosen place. So it's interesting, right, that the interpretation here is that you're allowed to have meat that is not for the purpose of sacrifice and eat it and consume it in your homes, and that the verses here are understood to mean, as opposed and in contradistinction to meat that would be brought as an offering to God. And the reason I'm going over this again is because there is an interpretation, and if I'm not mistaken, it is a Karaite interpretation that understands this rak, this only, meaning to say that the only time you're able to consume meat is unless you have also brought it as an offering. So that's a major distinction, and I believe it is a Karaite interpretation that you cannot consume meat, Chullin meat, and the only way you can do it is if there is a temple and if you can actually bring the meat there and then offer it up, and then possibly as part of that, if my understanding is correct, then you can consume meat, because we know, and it's going to mention it, that there were offerings like shlamim, where the family would partake of the offering as well. So this is going to, at least in terms of the traditional understanding of the Torah here, we're going to go on with that. So we're going to see, right? We just talked about the fact that you had to bring sacrificial meat to the temple, meat that had been either vowed and as an offering or obligatory offerings. V'asita olotecha, and you shall perform your olot, right? These offerings, habasar v'hadam, both the meat and the blood, al mizbach Hashem Elohecha, on the altar of the Lord your God, v'dam zevachecha, and the blood of your offerings, yishafech, shall be poured out al mizbach Hashem Elokecha, on the altar of the Lord your God. We know that some of the blood was poured out at the base of the altar, v'habasar tochel, and in that case, you can eat the meat. So Rashi is going to tease out exactly what this verse is talking about, because it's talking about two different kinds of offerings. We know that an olah, a burnt offering, was completely offered, essentially, part of it on the altar, part of it was burnt outside, and only the hide of the offering would go to the priests. But when it came to shlamim, part of it went up on the altar, part of it went, a designated part went to the priests, and then a part of it, the remainder, went to the family who had offered up the offering. So that's really what we're talking about. The zavachecha is as opposed to olah, as olotecha. That's how the verse is stating it. Let's take a look and see if we have the Rashi on this. Here, v'asita olotecha, you shall perform your olah, your whole offering. And Rashi says it so succinctly and beautifully, im olothem, if they turn out to be olo sacrifices. Tain habasar, you shall place the meat or give the meat, v'hadam, and the blood, al gabei hamizbeach, on the altar. The im zivchei shlamim heim, however, if they're shlamim offerings, dam zvachecha yishafech ala mizbeach, then the blood of the offering shall be poured out on the altar, mitchila, initially, v'achar kach, and after that, v'habasar tochel, and you can consume the meat, you can eat the meat. V'odashu rabotenu, and our sages, in addition, interpreted. They understood from this verse, right? And this is in the Sifrei. It's a Tanaitic midrash and a halachic midrash on both the book of Numbers and the book of Deuteronomy. Rak kodashecha, only with regards to your sacred offerings, sheba, that phrase comes lalamed, to teach us, al hakodashim shebechutz laaretz, referring to sacrificial offerings that may have been offered outside the land of Israel, ulalamed al hatmurot, and to also teach you regarding tmurot. A tmurah is if you is a replacement. In other words, it refers to a situation where you brought an offering and then decided you wanted to replace that offering with something else, with a different animal, something like that. And that, right? That's a tmurah in the place of the original. The al vladot kodashim, and if an animal, suppose you are offering up a female animal and it gave birth in the meantime before you actually offered it up, sheyakrivu, they all needed to be brought to the altar. So even if you make an offering outside, a vow outside the land of Israel, that still ultimately had to be brought onto the altar. You couldn't change your mind. You couldn't say, oh yeah, I'm going to replace it with something else, or the fact that I made it outside the land of Israel means it doesn't have that level of holiness, etc. All those would be included when it said only. So in other words, as opposed to the other offerings.
So when it says al hakodashim shebachutz laaretz,
Yes.
it doesn't mean there was actually a place outside the land of Israel to offer a sacrifice.
Correct. That is my understanding anyway. Yeah. I'm not aware there's nothing I've ever read to suggest that there was something chutz la'aretz. And of course, we know that when the kingdom was divided, and there was a northern kingdom and a southern kingdom, and Jeroboam set up a temple in Samaria in Shomron, to prevent them going to Jerusalem, which was in Judah. That was against the law. I mean, he was violating Torah. And that's the only other temple that I'm aware of where they may have offered up sacrifices. But it was, as I said, it was contrary to biblical commandment. Going on, Shemor v'shamata. So you should guard, right? V'shamata, and you should understand or hear or hearken to et kol hadvarim ha'ele, all these words, all these matters, asher anochi mitzavcha, which I am commanding you, mitzaveka is the way that's pronounced, leman yitav lacha, in order that it go well with you, ulevanecha acharecha, and your offspring following you, ad olam, forever. Ki ta'aseh hatov, because you will be doing hatov, the good, the hayashar, and the upright, be'enei Hashem Elokecha, literally in the eyes of the Lord your God. So it's saying these practices are important, fundamental practices in terms of worshiping God and showing loyalty to God. And it's interesting because this is one of those few cases where a reward is being, that there is a reward for the performance of these mitzvah, of this particular mitzvah. Although it may, when it's referring here, it may be referring specifically to the laws regarding eating meat and Chullin, etc., because that's what we've been talking about, which would suggest that our consumption of meat and how we go about doing it is a very important element to our practice before God, according to the Torah. So, shamor. So what does it mean? Guard, right? And again, in the Sifrei, it says, Zo Mishnah. This is referring to, if we want to translate Mishnah, of course, it would be the oral law. But here, it's from the word shnayim, which means two. And we could, in fact, interpret this as this refers to reviewing, going over, meditating on, just really constantly going over the laws. She'ata tzarich l'shamra bevitnecha, because you have to guard it in your innards, in your stomach. In other words, you need to internalize, right? We could say it like that, right? It's so important for you to internalize these laws. And I think that's actually a very profound and insightful observation and mitzvah here, because I think it is very easy for us to see these things as ideals as opposed to reality. And the idea of taking these ideals and making them a part of who we are and our very identity, that's how we're understanding this. And I've mentioned this before, but I think that is the metaphor of taking Torah from heaven and bringing it down to earth. Is that this whole important notion of internalizing and actualizing these particular things, so that they aren't just honored, in principle, but nothing more than that. Going on, shelo tishkach, so that you don't forget. You won't ignore them. You won't forget them. Ke'inyan shene'emar, and it follows what is stated in Mishlei, which is the book of Proverbs, chapter 22. And here he pulls it all together. Ki na'im, for it is pleasant. It is a pleasant thing. Ki tishmereim bevit nacha. There we have it, where you guard them. There's that shamor, right? And he mentions bevit nacha, in your innards, in your stomach. In other words, if you internalize these things so that they become part of your values and how you choose to live your life. Ve'im shanita, and there's this Mishnah, right? So here shanita meaning review, right? If you go over it. If shar, it becomes possible now, shetishma, that you will, and you can understand, right? We could understand the word shema, but it can also mean obey, the tikayim, and you will bring it into existence. You'll actually practice it. So if you don't study, this is what I was saying before, that Talmud Torah Keneged Kulam, that if you don't review it, if you kind of ignore it and stuff like that, there's little chance of it actually coming into being as part of your life. Going on. HaKol she'eno bichlal mishnah. So he says anything that is not included in review, in other words, if it isn't going to be reviewed constantly, eno bichlal maseh, in that case, it's not going to be practiced. So look at that. I mean, again, you could be referring to that statement in the Shema where it says, Veshinan tam levanecha, right? You should review them with your children. So having this as a discussion, right? Talking about it, spending time to think about it and to learn about it, and to makes it possible then for it now to become part of who we are. Et kol hadvarim, all these words. So, shetehei chaviva alecha mitzvah. He is commenting now on kol hadvarim, because it could have said et hadvarim. So what's the force of the word all these words? So he's saying that a mitzvah kala, that a light and easy mitzvah, not a profound mitzvah, chaviva alecha, should be as precious to you ka mitzvah chamura, as a very serious mitzvah. So, I'm trying to think of examples, but a serious mitzvah would be thou shalt not murder, right? Something that has profound implications. And a light mitzvah, at least in our own eyes, might be like taking interest, something like that, or making sure that you return things in proper time, being punctual about returning things. So I'm just trying to think of examples, and maybe you can come up with better examples than I did, but I think that's the point that's being made here. We shouldn't say, oh, it's just not that important. Hatov, okay. So again, the Hatov v'hayashar, right? You shall be doing the good and the upright. So he says, Hatov be'enei hashamayim. So he says, when you're doing good, that's in the sight of heaven, meaning, of course, in the sight of God, v'hayashar, and the upright, right, the straight. And of course, we know where that's going to go, be'enei adam, meaning other human beings. And again, very succinctly, but even so, the idea that doing things that are right in the eyes of heaven and also in the eyes of your fellow human beings is important. That it isn't one excluding the other. That they're all included. And I think this is a great place for us to stop today. And with God's help, we will continue tomorrow. My plan is to meet tomorrow morning. Mark that in there. And I'll stop the share. Any comments before I take off the recording? Shira Beth, did you want to say something for the record? Okay. All right. Yeah.
Are we planning to meet every Wednesday as a default now?
During the summer when I don't have to take Miles to school, I can get this off the recording. This doesn't have to be recorded. So I'm going to stop the recording.